There is a reason why official history never mentioned what was found in Babylon in 1936, and it is not because evidence is lacking. Under the scorching sun of Iraq, a team of archaeologists unearthed something that should not exist, a common ceramic jar containing metal parts that, in a laboratory, produced electricity. Electricity. 2,000 years ago, before Rome, before Christ, before any advanced civilization that history books tell us about. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Meters below the sand lay the evidence of a truth that completely destroys the narrative of linear progress. Pressurized sewage systems, optical lenses of surgical precision, bronze analog computers, chambers with perfect acoustics based on advanced physics, radiant floor heating, antibacterial air filters, automated irrigation systems. They were not isolated finds. It was infrastructure. It was the standard of living of a metropolis that had piped hot water while medieval Europeans were still throwing waste out the window, which mastered advanced metallurgy when our civilized ancestors could barely forge swords. The question is not, how did they do this? The question is, why have they hidden this from us for so long? Because if Babylon had this level of development 4,000 years ago, the entire history of civilization we learn in school is a fraud. And someone has a great interest in keeping this fraud alive. The Baghdad Battery and other enigmas. The decisive moment occurred on the Mesopotamian plains. During 1936, in the vicinity of the Iraqi capital, explorers unearthed a ceramic container containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod inside it. The man holding that object did not know he was holding a historiographical bomb. It was just a clay vase with metal parts inside. One more item to catalogue, photograph, archive, until someone decided to test what would happen if they filled it with vinegar or grape juice. The cylinder began to generate electric current. There, in that improvised laboratory, in 1938, a team of scientists watched in silence a 2,000-year-old artifact producing electricity. No one spoke for a few minutes, because if that was what it seemed to be, all the history books were wrong. 2 years later, in 1938, the archaeologist Wilhelm König presented a revolutionary proposal. That object functioned as a primitive electrochemical cell. An audacious theory emerged, suggesting that such devices could have been employed in rudimentary processes of metallic electroplating. These material evidences compel us to recognize that millennial civilizations possessed technical knowledge that only now we are beginning to fully decipher. Among the most impressive discoveries was a complex infrastructure of piping buried under the foundations of the main palace. The excavators revealed an elaborate network of conduits manufactured from baked clay, installed with remarkable geometric precision. Urban history experts state that complete systems of sanitation and pressurized water distribution emerged only after multiple centuries of gradual development. However, one of the engineering technicians participating in the expedition decided to personally investigate the functioning of that ancient network. Advanced hydraulic engineering. His analysis revealed that the piping segments were joined through a sophisticated waterproofing compound based on organic resins. This technical solution allowed fluids to circulate under considerable pressure without infiltration into the surrounding soil. The conclusion was inescapable. Millennia before the emergence of modern metropolises, the inhabitants of Babylon already enjoyed urban amenities that we consider recent achievements of contemporary civilization. Here is the problem. If the Babylonians had pressurized piped water, they had hydraulic engineers. If they had hydraulic engineers, they had advanced mathematics. If they had advanced mathematics, they had educational institutions. If they had educational institutions, they had a structured society where knowledge did not die with the individual, which means that entire city was an intellectual ecosystem functioning at full capacity. We are not talking about luck or isolated geniuses. We are talking about civilization. During investigations in residential zones, researchers came across a residence that had belonged to a prosperous merchant. In the rooms, under thick layers of accumulated sediment, they found strange vitreous discs. These objects presented perfect transparency and exhibited a slight thickening in their central region. The traditional scientific community states that humanity developed the capacity to manufacture high-quality optical lenses only during the medieval period. However, when one of the archaeologists inadvertently positioned one of these discs over a clay tablet with tiny inscriptions, the characters suddenly enlarged dramatically, becoming sharp and legible. The archaeologist dropped the lens as if it had burned his hand, because he had just understood what that meant. If the Babylonians manufactured precision optical lenses, they observed stars. If they observed stars with lenses, they mapped constellations with precision. If they mapped constellations, they performed astronomical calculations. And if they performed astronomical calculations 4,000 years ago, how many other scientific discoveries were already ready when Galileo pointed his telescope at the sky? How many times has humanity already invented the same thing? Surprising optics and metallurgy. It was an authentic magnifying lens, manufactured by a craftsman who deeply understood the principles of light refraction long before physics emerged as a formal discipline. This small artifact completely revolutionized our understanding of how ancient scholars investigated the universe and observed celestial bodies. Particularly impressive was the inventory of metallic instruments discovered. In one of the craft workshops, archaeologists unearthed saws and drills manufactured with a metallic alloy that had remained free of oxidation for millennia. The official historical record informs us that in that period societies worked exclusively with ductile copper or relatively soft bronze. The established paradigm assumes that the processing of resistant rocks like granite was executed through manual abrasion or using common sand as a cutting agent. However, the marks preserved on the Babylonian slabs told a completely different narrative. Deep and uniform grooves were visible on the stony surface, furrows that can only be produced by extremely hard metallic tools operating at high rotational speed. A contemporary master stonemason accompanying the excavations categorically declared that such marks are characteristic of modern motorized cutting equipment. The hypothesis of mechanical processes in antiquity could fundamentally alter our understanding of technological evolution. Then, theories began to emerge. Some sensible, others delusional. Aliens, Atlantis, time travelers. Everything except the most obvious and most terrifying explanation. They were exactly like us. They had the same brains, the same needs, the same capacity to solve problems. The only difference is that we have an instruction manual left by previous generations. They had nothing. They had to discover everything from scratch. And even so, they reached results that took us millennia to replicate. What does that say about us? Ancient computational mechanisms. Concluding the inspection of the workshops, the team located an enigmatic mechanism built with interlocking bronze gears. Although severely deteriorated by the passing of millennia, even its remaining fragments evidence that it constituted a component of some sophisticated calculating device. Contemporary educational manuals state that complex gear mechanisms emerged exclusively in Renaissance Europe. Conventional historians insist that ancient peoples could build only simple levers and basic pulleys, but that thing in the researchers' hands was not a simple lever. It was an analog computer, a mechanical device capable of predicting solar eclipses, lunar cycles, movement of the planets, all through bronze gears that fitted together with microscopic precision. When they digitally reconstructed the mechanism, modern engineers fell silent, because creating that today with CNC and CAD technology would be complex. Creating that with hammer and chisel would be practically impossible. But they created it, and it worked. However, this apparatus unequivocally demonstrated that Babylon housed engineers capable of designing machines destined for the calculation of planetary movements. Such discoveries present researchers with extremely challenging questions, demanding completely renewed methodological approaches. Each of these artifacts turns into a silent witness of something we deeply underestimate. Ancestors who may have mastered manufacturing techniques, subsequently forgotten for entire millennia. Deliberate architectural acoustics. Proceeding with excavations in the central region of Babylon, archaeologists confronted a history that had remained hidden not only under terrestrial strata, but also veiled by the silence of local traditions. One of the most experienced native workers, who had assisted the group since the beginning, one day led the professors to a location where the ground had collapsed after intense rainfall. There, in the deep erosion, the edge of a massive slab coated with a layer of organic resin was visible. The elder murmured that his grandfather called that place House of Silence, where ancient priests supposedly preserved the very voice of the heavens. The team descended. Darkness swallowed the flashlights. The air was still, dense, as if no one had breathed there in 3,000 years, and then one of the researchers whispered something. Just one word. But that word came back, multiplied, amplified, echoing off the walls with enough force to make the others step back startled. It was not an echo. It was acoustic amplification, sound engineering. That chamber transformed whispers into thunder. And suddenly, everyone understood. They understood why ancient texts spoke of voices of the gods, because anyone who entered there and spoke would be heard as a deity. When they managed to move the slab, the team revealed a narrow descent leading to a compact chamber with absolutely perfect acoustics. Lined along the walls were cylindrical terracotta jars whose openings were directed toward the center of the enclosure. Established science generally states that such vessels were employed exclusively for storing cereals or fermented beverages. University historians convincingly maintain that Babylonian architecture prioritized only external visual magnificence. However, in that chamber everything worked differently. If a person positioned themselves centrally and pronounced words, even whispers were amplified and multiplied repeatedly, returning with intensity as if they were reproduced by a powerful modern speaker. The expedition's engineers marveled at the extraordinary precision in the calculations of the inclination angles of the walls and the geometry of the resonant containers. Ingenious lighting systems. It became evident that for the Babylonians, acoustic manipulation was as fundamental as daily bread. In such chambers, crucial municipal assemblies or trials could be held where the voice of authorities needed to sound imposing and clear, without any additional vocal effort. It was not a matter of magic or mysticism. It was pure applied physics, which ancient builders mastered to organize life in their gigantic metropolis with greater efficiency. Another intriguing episode occurred during investigations into how the Babylonians lit their monumental constructions. Archaeologists remained perplexed for a considerable time, questioning how workers operated in the depths of corridors completely devoid of openings for natural light. Academic consensus maintains that ancient inhabitants employed flaming torches or lamps fueled by vegetable oils. However, on the ceilings of Babylonian structures, scientists did not identify even the smallest trace of carbonized soot. If torches burned continuously for years, the stony surfaces would exhibit characteristic blackening. Historians frequently neglect this evidence, claiming that the walls could simply have been cleaned regularly. But one of the group's participants discovered in the courtyard remnants of an elaborate system of mirrors manufactured from highly polished bronze. Revolutionary domestic comfort. The mirrors were mounted on mobile articulated supports, directing light beams from the external area to strategic points in the corridors. The reflection system transmitted illumination to the most remote rooms. It was an ancient light conduction system that made it possible to flood underground spaces with bright direct sunlight. This discovery explained why Babylonian existence seemed so clean and radiant. They did not saturate the air with combustion smoke, but literally forced the sun to penetrate their domains. Think of the level of sophistication necessary for this. They had to calculate reflection angles. They had to cast bronze with enough purity to create mirrored surfaces. They had to create articulated supports that allowed adjustment as the sun's position changed throughout the day. This is not primitive. This is applied optics, advanced physics, and it was standard in common residential constructions. We are not talking about technology reserved for temples or palaces. We are talking about urban infrastructure, as if every apartment in Babylon came equipped with solar panels. Particularly fascinating was investigating the daily life of common residents of the city. In one of the dwellings, archaeologists found a peculiar stone bathtub connected to two ascending conduits, one upper and another lower. The official narrative states that ancient peoples simply poured water from containers over their bodies. It is presumed that heating water in that period was an extremely time-consuming and complex procedure. However, under that bath, researchers identified a small, slow combustion chamber for incandescent embers that functioned essentially like a contemporary boiler. A Babylonian could enjoy a heated bath after an exhausting journey simply by lighting a small fire in the specialized compartment. It represented a level of domestic comfort that in Europe emerged only 2 millennia later. 2 millennia. Let that sink in. While Romans were still building basic aqueducts, Babylonians already had piped hot water inside their homes. While medieval Europeans threw waste out the window, Babylonians had pressurized sewage. The timeline is inverted. Evolution was not linear. It was a chaotic zigzag where entire civilizations reached peaks of development, disappeared, and forced humanity to reinvent the wheel. Literally. Metallurgical and sanitary knowledge. The mystery of the discoveries manifested itself in the most ordinary details. For example, in the kitchen of a residence, copper cauldrons and utensils coated with a thin film of silver were found. Modern science interprets this as decorative ornamentation, but analyzing from a pragmatic perspective, silver possesses antimicrobial properties and preserves drinking water for significantly prolonged periods. It was revealed that ancient Babylonian matriarchs knew the properties of metallic elements and applied them deliberately to protect their families from illnesses. They did not merely prepare food, they applied practical chemical knowledge in their domestic routine. This narrative of Babylon demonstrates that we frequently underestimate our ancestors, erroneously categorizing them as primitive. However, by examining their hydraulic piping, reflective lighting systems, and domestic heating, it becomes crystal clear that their lives were organized in a considerably more intelligent and ecologically sustainable way than ours. We discovered not just archaeological ruins, but traces of a civilization that knew how to exist harmoniously with nature, employing intellect to create comfort without needing to devastate the surrounding environment. Rethinking technological history. Each of these discoveries represents a serious challenge to official manuals that portray ancient people as skilled but intellectually limited artisans. Archaeologists continued excavations and revealed under sandy layers a system of urban planning that impressed by its structural logic. Along the main roads were found traces of peculiar structures built with baked bricks, through which passed copper rods fixed in thick natural resin. Established academic understanding states that copper in that period was used exclusively for jewelry, weaponry, or domestic utensils. Historians maintain absolute conviction that any knowledge about electricity or energy transmission in antiquity constitutes mere unfounded speculation. However, if these copper structures effectively served for protection of buildings against atmospheric discharges or dissipation of static charges, this would mean that the Babylonians understood the physics of atmospheric phenomena millennia before Benjamin Franklin. This completely transforms our perception of how safe and meticulously planned life was in that ancient metropolis. There was a plan, not just for the palace or the temple, for the entire city. Someone sat with parchment, ink, and calculations and designed that place the same way we design modern cities, with residential, commercial, industrial zones, with electrical infrastructure, or something like it, with atmospheric protection systems, with urban planning that took into consideration not only the present, but future generations. This requires bureaucracy. It requires a functional government. It requires institutions that survive beyond the king of the moment. Babylon was not a city. It was a modern state 3 millennia before the concept of a modern state existed. Advanced tools and processes. In daily life, this manifested with extraordinary precision. In one of the artisanal neighborhoods, scientists located a stone processing workshop. There were basalt slabs whose surface was polished to achieve a perfect specular shine. Modern science states that polishing in antiquity was achieved through months of strenuous manual work using abrasive sand and water. However, under microscopic magnification, characteristic microscopic circular marks were visible on the surface of the stone, which are generally left by mechanized rotating tools. This suggests the possibility that the Babylonians possessed not just primitive techniques, but efficient, functional machines. If this hypothesis is confirmed, then the history of technology requires fundamental revision. We would discover that labor mechanization did not start in the 15th century, but in ancient times, only that knowledge was subsequently lost. Another fact that compels science to question established dogmas relates to medicine and applied chemistry. In one of the residences, archaeologists found a set of ceramic containers with narrow necks. Analysis of their residual contents revealed the presence of acids and metallic salts. Official history states that chemistry as a scientific discipline emerged only in the medieval period through alchemists. Ancient chemical sophistication. Scientists traditionally presumed that ancient peoples used exclusively materials that nature provided in pure and unaltered form. However, these vessels could have been components of chemical gold-plating processes for precious ornaments. If Babylonian jewelers employed chemical deposition of gold, in addition to simple mechanical forging, this proves the presence of deep knowledge about the atomic structure of matter. The existence of wealthy residents of Babylon was filled with objects whose creation would have required highly complex laboratories, whose existence we had never even imagined previously. The city's food supply system deserves particularly special attention. This investigation into the archaeological layers of Babylon reveals an uncomfortable truth for conventional historical narratives. Ancient civilizations were not simply primitive societies awaiting the enlightened progress of modernity. They were centers of technological innovation and scientific knowledge that in many aspects rivaled or surpassed achievements we proudly attribute exclusively to recent eras. The real mystery is not how they achieved such accomplishments, but how this extraordinary knowledge was lost, forgotten, and subsequently rediscovered through millennia of human development. Ancestral agricultural automation. During the explorations, archaeologists unearthed evidence of canals equipped with mechanisms driven by river currents. They were transmission systems built with elaborate gears from resistant wood and bronze. According to conventional chronology, similar complex transmissions emerged exclusively in classical Greece. However, the Babylonian finds demonstrate unequivocally that the automation of agricultural irrigation systems constituted an established and common practice. This revelation radically transforms our understanding of ancient economic history. If the populations had functional agricultural machinery, consequently, they had time available to dedicate themselves to sciences and arts. This elucidates the reason why Babylon emerged as a world cultural epicenter. Simultaneously, the intriguing question remains: for what reason did these technologies not spread geographically and end up forgotten during subsequent centuries? The enigma of these discoveries does not lie in suggesting extraterrestrial technology, but in demonstrating how logical and perfectly integrated they were in daily existence. In ordinary residential buildings, solar observation devices were located that made it possible to determine the time with minute precision. We are used to considering that time for the ancient man represented a flexible and imprecise concept, but Babylon proves that their lives were meticulously planned and governed by rigorous mathematical principles. Re-evaluating the narrative of human progress. If all these data are officially recognized, the history of humanity will cease to resemble a slow and painful ascent from obscurity. It will begin to look like a sequence of brilliant bursts of creativity. Babylon represented one of those extraordinary efflorescences in which the human mind demonstrated the capacity to create a comfortable and technologically sophisticated existence using locally available materials. Each fragment of mechanism discovered or chemical composition found in ancient jars constitutes motivation to admit that we are not the first to conceive complex solutions. Our ancestors simply followed their own trajectories, and those trajectories were considerably more progressive than antiquated educational manuals try to persuade us. Natural climate control systems. One of the most surprising discoveries became the extensive ventilation system that permeated the city underground. Established science usually considers that ancient megacities were stuffy and smelly places where populations suffered from overheating and unpleasant odors. University academics state that the ventilation of facilities in that period depended exclusively on open windows and doors. However, under Babylon, researchers revealed a network of vertical wells that penetrated deep into the subsoil and connected through horizontal tunnels. At the bottom of these wells, there was always water coming from hidden underground canals. When the scorching desert air entered one of these wells, it suddenly cooled upon contacting the water and, under pressure, was forced to enter residential rooms through specialized openings in the floor. Thus, there existed a natural climate control system that operated without any mechanical motor. The life of a common urban inhabitant was protected from the suffocating heat. People could rest in the coolness of their residences, while externally the temperature soared beyond 40 degrees Celsius. Sophisticated air filtration. This discovery completely transforms our conception of past architecture, proving that the Babylonians were capable of controlling atmospheric flows with precision comparable to that of contemporary engineers. The mystery of this discovery intensified when, in some of these ventilation systems, remnants of peculiar filters were found. They were manufactured with multiple layers of fine copper mesh and palm fibers soaked in antiseptic compositions. Academic science generally states that the concept of atmospheric hygiene emerged only in the 20th century. It is presumed that ancient peoples were unaware of the existence of dust or microorganisms transported by the wind. However, these filters indicate that the Babylonians were deeply concerned with the quality of the air they breathed. They consciously purified the atmosphere of sandy particles and impurities, creating a unique microclimate within the city. It was a civilization that prioritized human health and comfort, employing refined knowledge of biology and physics for this purpose. Advanced document protection. During the investigation process, archaeologists came across a commercial gallery or building that, by all appearances, functioned as an ancient archive or banking institution. Inside there were thousands of clay tablets, but it was not them that captured scientific attention, but rather the very arrangement of the shelves. The shelves were made of carbonized wood, coated with a special fire-resistant varnish. When researchers tried to set fire to a fragment of this coating, it only darkened slightly but did not produce flames. Official history states that fireproof materials represent an achievement of the chemical industry of recent centuries. However, the Babylonians already understood how to protect their crucial documents from fires that occurred frequently in densely built cities. The daily existence of Babylonian officials or bankers was surrounded by elements that guaranteed information security. They did not merely write on clay, they created security systems that we are used to considering modern. In the same building, peculiar seals were found made with an alloy of metals that were impossible to forge through common casting. Anti-counterfeiting security. Each of these seals possessed a unique microscopic structure, a pattern that could be viewed only under a certain angle of light incidence. This was an ancestral protection against forgeries, a type of holographic sticker of that time. This discovery forces us to reconsider the history of criminology and law, demonstrating that the financial system of Babylon was protected much more seriously than is usually considered in scientific circles. Advancing further, in the urban outskirts, archaeologists discovered the remnants of an irrigation system that supplied water not only to agricultural fields, but also to private gardens of urban residents. Modern science states that irrigation in Mesopotamia was primitive. Slaves simply collected water with leather bags and poured it into ditches. Historians declare that it was heavy and ineffective work. Automated irrigation. However, under Babylon, they found a system of automatic floodgates that activated when the water level in the canal reached a certain point. There were internal floats made of cork and stone counterweights. When the water rose, the buoy propelled the lever and the valve opened, allowing the water to flow to the desired area. As soon as the level decreased, the system closed automatically. This made it possible for gardens to be irrigated 24 hours daily without human intervention. The life of the Babylonian gardener was automated to a level that seems extraordinary for that era. Thanks to this, the city literally drowned in vegetation, transforming into a flourishing oasis in the middle of a sterile desert. The discovery modifies our understanding of agricultural history. Ancestral precise cartography. The mystery of the discoveries reached its peak when they located a time capsule in one of the foundations. Inside it was an urban drawing executed on a thin sheet of bronze. In this drawing, communication lines were traced that the archaeologists had not yet had time to completely unearth. But the most extraordinary thing was that the scale of the map was observed with millimetric precision. Academic science insists that ancient maps were schematic and imprecise because people did not have devices to measure large distances. But this bronze plate proved the contrary. The Babylonians possessed topographic survey methods that allowed them to visualize the city as a single entity, as if they observed it from a great altitude. Advanced writing instruments. Concluding this stage of work, researchers discovered a warehouse of writing instruments. Among common clay fragments were scattered strange pens with internal metallic tips that contained a cavity for ink. They were the predecessors of modern fountain pens. The official version states that such pens emerged only in the 19th century. It is believed that ancient peoples constantly dipped their instruments into inkwells, making the writing process prolonged and dirty. However, Babylonian pens managed to write for hours without diverting attention from the parchment or leather. This transforms the history of writing and education, demonstrating that the rate of informational circulation in Babylon was much higher than what we are used to assuming. All these discoveries, from fireproof varnishes to automatic irrigation systems, form the image of a world where man was not a slave to nature. He was its partner, who knew how to employ physical laws for his convenience. The history of humanity, as it is taught today, seems incomplete and fragmented, because it does not consider these ingenious solutions of ancient engineers. Then the question arises that no one wants to ask. Why? Why did this disappear? How does a civilization with this level of development simply go out? There is no off button for collective knowledge. There is no delete for centuries of scientific progress. Unless there is. Unless civilizational collapse is not just a dramatic metaphor, but a literal description of what happens when complex systems fail. Babylon shows us the ceiling of what humans can achieve. But it also shows us that this ceiling is no guarantee. You can have hot water, an electrical system, sophisticated urban planning today, and be throwing stones at animals 500 years from now. This has already happened. It can happen again. Domestic mechanization. Babylon continued to reveal its secrets under the archaeologists' feet, proving that progress is not just about electricity and the internet, but above all, about the mental capacity to solve complex problems with simple and effective methods. Continuing the path along ancestral pavements, archaeologists came across a residential building that was better preserved than the others. In it was discovered an object that at first appearance resembled a common culinary appliance. It was a huge stone slab with a smooth depression and a heavy cylinder that fitted perfectly into it. Academic science generally describes such finds as grain mills, claiming that the life of ancient women consisted of endless and difficult manual grinding sessions. Scientists claim it was exhausting work that occupied all available time. However, a more detailed inspection of the cylinder's axis revealed traces of attachment for a transmission belt. It turns out that this mill was part of a small mechanical unit that was set in motion either by a domestic animal or a small water wheel in the backyard. The woman did not need to rub stone against stone for hours. She simply added grains, and the mechanism performed all the work for her. Liberation of time through technology. It was an ancient household appliance that freed up time for children's education or self-education. Such a discovery radically changes the concept of Babylon's social structure. It turns out that even in common families, time was valued and human labor, and engineering thought aimed to alleviate daily concerns. This proves that technological progress concerned not just palaces and temples, but also penetrated into every residence. In the same house in the storage room, researchers found sealed containers made of a special type of ceramic, coated with a layer of enamel internally. When one of these containers was opened, inside, they discovered oil that for thousands of years did not go rancid and maintained its properties. The official history of medicine and chemistry claims that food preservation without modern additives and vacuum packaging for such a long period is impossible. Sophisticated food preservation. It is believed that ancient peoples constantly suffered from low food quality, but the Babylonians employed for preservation natural resins and a certain combination of minerals in the ceramic composition that created inside the vessel an environment that inhibited bacterial growth. It was applied biology in action, integrated into the daily life of the most common families. Of particular interest was the floor in a room of this house. It was of dual use, and between the layers of bricks there were empty spaces containing remains of grass and burnt charcoal. Modern science believes that heating houses in antiquity was limited to central fires in the middle of rooms from which much smoke and soot came out. Historians maintain that people simply wrapped themselves in skins so as not to freeze in winter. Radiant floor heating system. But the found underfloor heat system proved that the Babylonians understood the principles of thermal convection. Hot air from a small stove, located outside the house, circulated under the floor, heating the beds and simultaneously without polluting the room's air with combustion products. It was a level of comfort that today we consider a sign of luxury housing, and for the residents of Babylon, this was the quality of life standard. The mystery of these discoveries was their scope. It was not a mere whim of a rich man. There existed a culture of comfort that permeated the entire city. Archaeologists discovered in the neighboring quarter a workshop where footwear was manufactured. There they found sandals with a sole that absorbed impacts, inside of which were placed layers of flexible cork and thin copper wire. Ergonomics in ancient footwear academic science states that ancient footwear was flat and harmful to the foot. It is believed that orthopedics is a science of the last 100 years, but Babylonian shoemakers created footwear that took into consideration the load on the spine during long walks on stone pavements. The life of an urban inhabitant who moved a lot on commercial or construction matters was protected by these small engineering tricks. The discoveries in Babylon make us completely revise historical manuals. If it was previously believed that the ancient world was an era of manual labor and superstition, now we see that our ancestors possessed advanced technologies. Recognizing that thousands of years ago, people employed natural lighting systems, complex mechanisms, and even chemical principles for gold-plating metals, changes the very essence of historical chronology. It turns out that the industrial and scientific revolution did not start in Europe a few centuries ago, but in deep antiquity. It is just that much knowledge was subsequently lost or forgotten. These discoveries change history from a straight line of progress to a chain of highs and lows. This proves that humanity has already achieved a high standard of living and comfort without employing electricity or oil. Such facts force scientists to admit that ancient civilizations were not a step toward our time, but quite independent and developed worlds. The history of Babylon teaches us that great knowledge can disappear if it is not carefully cultivated, and that we are far from being the first who learned to control the forces of nature for a comfortable life. Excavations continue. Every meter of sand removed reveals more devices, more mechanisms, more evidence that our timeline is wrong. And the question remains, whispering under every discovery. What else is buried there? What other technologies are waiting in the depths, ready to rewrite everything we thought we knew? Because if they had all this, if they mastered engineering, physics, chemistry, medicine to this level, what stopped them from going further? From creating something that would change not just history, but the very nature of human reality? Perhaps they did create it. Perhaps it is down there, waiting. And perhaps we are not ready to find it.